All right, hey, Stat 113 people. So we're picking up where we left off with sampling. So we had talked about advantages of disadvantages of doing a census and advantages and disadvantages of taking a sample. One disadvantage of the sample was that we needed to make sure that it was representative. And so now we are going to talk about some different sampling strategies, some of which are going to be better than others. And so for this sampling example, we're going to suppose that we're interested in collecting data on dissolved organic carbon. And so like dissolved organic carbon, again, like I'm not really a biologist, but I think it's some measure that's kind of associated with pollution. So if we're interested in seeing how polluted different lakes are in the United States, we might be interested in measuring this dissolved organic carbon, or DOC. And so in this case, our population of interest is going to be all lakes in the United States, and we're going to say that have a depth larger than 50 meters. So we're kind of constraining ourselves to just lakes that have a certain depth. We've got a list of all of these lakes, so there's 1,206 of them, and we also have the state that each lake is in. And so take a second to go ahead and like pause the video and see if you can draw a sketch of what a tidy data matrix would look like, just with kind of some made up lakes. Okay, so that might have been kind of difficult depending on your lake knowledge of the United States, but something like you would have the lake and the state that it's in on the columns, and I'm just going to number them on the rows all the way down to 1206. So maybe Lake Placid is in New York. I lived in Oregon, so Crater Lake I know is in Oregon, and I know that that has a depth bigger than 50 meters, and then we go all the way down the list to maybe Lake Superior, which is going to be in Michigan. Okay, so that's kind of what our population looks like. Notice that we don't have a column for dissolved organic carbon because we don't know what that is for each lake, and we know that we're not going to do a census, and so we're only going to measure some of these lakes are going to have a measurement for dissolved organic carbon. All right, so we are going to do this fun little brief diversion in class. So I'm just going to write class. That's more for me than for you, so that I remember that we should do that. And we're going to jump to this question about why we might not want to perform a census. So take a second to think about that question. Why in this lake example would we not want to do a census? All right, so remember, a census would be going to all 1,206 lakes. And the question is, like, do you have the time to go to all 1,206 lakes? All right, so I certainly don't have the time. I guess this could also boil down to money. If someone was paying me to go to all 1,206 lakes, I would love to do that. But most likely no one's going to have the time or money to go to all of those lakes very often to collect the dissolved organic carbon measurements. So since we aren't doing a census, we're going to talk about different ways that we could do a sample. And so the first is called a simple random sample, and it is the simplest possible way. So you could think about it as just being like a simple raffle type deal or a simple lottery. And so in this example, each case has an equal chance of being selected. And so this is just equivalent to a simple raffle. So imagine you're just throwing all the lake names into a hat, and you're pulling out, maybe if you want to go to 100 lakes, you're pulling out 100 lake names. And those are the lakes that you're going to go sample. So in our lake example, it would just be randomly select 100 lakes to be in our sample. I just picked 100. That number is going to depend on how much time and money you think you have to go to these different lakes. Okay, so that's the simplest possible random sample. The next that we're going to talk about is stratified. And so for a stratified sample, what we're going to do is divide cases into strata. And strata are just groups. So we're going to divide these lakes into strata so that similar cases are grouped together. Then all we're going to do is take a simple random sample within each stratum, or within each group. So this is kind of easiest to see just with an example. And so if you go back to our data matrix, you'll see that we also have the state that each lake is in. So one way that you could think about taking a stratified random sample is to take a simple random sample of 2 lakes in each of the 50 states. So in each of the 50 US states. That's going to give you 100 lakes, and you're guaranteed to get 2 lakes in each state. And so we'll kind of talk about a little bit more about what the advantages and disadvantages of doing that would be after we talk about a cluster random sample. And so cluster is easy to mix up with stratified, so we'll also try to do a little diagram after we do this. But for a cluster sample, we're also going to break up our cases into groups. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to select a certain number of groups. And instead of just like we randomly selected a couple lakes from each of the 50 states, in this case we're going to sample every single observation within the selected groups. So in this lakes example, what we might do is we might randomly select 10 states and then sample all lakes within those states. And so it's kind of like the opposite, right? So with stratified, we're guaranteed to get 2 lakes from each state. With cluster, we're excluding the great majority of states, but within each state that we're actually sampling, we're getting every single lake from that state. And so in the next video, we'll kind of talk a little bit more about advantages and disadvantages of these two and when you might consider actually doing one over the other, as well as we'll kind of draw a diagram to hopefully help us clarify the difference between the two.